As Canada celebrated Canadian Multiculturalism Day on June 27th, the Immigrations Levels Plan 2021 to 2023 is simultaneously due to complete its first stage. Under this plan, Canada plans on welcoming approximately 1.2 million new permanent residents. This influx has the potential of transforming the core foundations of Canadian society, for better or possibly worse. What do the next 2 years mean for Canada? A dystopia of ethnic separatism and identity politics, as some imagine, or a melting pot, salad bowl, or mosaic, as others perceive it to be? One thing is sure: Canada is set to undergo a social change of a magnitude it last saw when ships from continental Europe first arrived on its shores. We are here today to understand what motivates and encourages this change, to highlight the contentions, the fears, and the doubts surrounding this likely transformation, and to inquire how 1.2 million new prospective Canadians will shape the ideological future of Canada. To answer our questions today, we are joined by Professor Keith Banting. Professor Banting is a professor at Queen's University in the Department of Political Studies, an author and researcher who has a special interest in ethnic diversity, immigration, and multiculturalism. Good afternoon, Professor Banting. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. And thanks for inviting me, by the way.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here virtually at the studio of Canadian Immigration News. So let's get into our discussion. The topic for our discussion today is post-nationalism and multiculturalism, the future of Canadian identity. Professor Banting, what does it mean to be Canadian today? Is there a singular collective culture that unifies Canadian society, or is there an absence of a shared identity amongst Canadians?
Canada has never had a shared cultural identity. Since the very founding of the country, the idea of a singular culture linking the entire country has been off the table. The presence of Quebec with a distinct language and culture meant that from the very beginning, we have had to find a way of defining Canada which did not presume a common culture, but rather had a kind of common orientation towards democracy, politics. It's more of a political community than a cultural one. So with that start, we simply moved increasingly in that direction as the country became more diverse on cultural, racial, religious dimensions.
So we've been hearing the term post-nationalism being thrown around. What exactly is post-nationalism, and does Canada qualify to be a post-national state?
I don't think so. If by post-national one means a situation in which citizens think of themselves as citizens of the world, or do not think of a kind of national identity as important to them, then I think the answer to that question is no. Quebecers clearly have a sense of national identity, which is very important to them and which shapes in significant ways the way they organize themselves politically within the province. And I think the rest of Canadians have a sense of being Canadian, of having a national identity. That identity may not have a common culture underpinning it, but I still think it's an orientation or identity that matters to people. So I don't think Canada's post-national. Rather, I would describe Canada as multinational. That is a country which has multiple nations within it.
So what is multinational is one thing and transnational is another. Does a sense of belonging to another country challenge Canadian identity? In a way, are transnational or multinational ties harmful to the idea of civic integration?
Well, there are two separate questions there.
Yes.
One is whether transnationalism is a fundamental challenge to a multicultural country. And my starting position on that question is that we and all the countries of the world are increasingly in a global hunt for skills, for talent, for ability, for people to round out and make robust each country and economy. There's a competition out there. And so I don't think of transnationalism as a threat to Canada as a country, as an economy, as a culture. it is true, I think, that transnationalism does raise some questions about integration. What do we expect of someone who's transnational, who may be here for a while, who may not think of Canada as their final point of destination? And so we may well have people in the country who choose, in some sense, not to integrate, not to become citizens, not to become people trying to shape the future of Canada inside the role of the group of citizens, but people who are here and are contributing, even though they may move on tomorrow. So I think it's a good thing generally, but it does raise questions about our expectations of whether people integrate and think of themselves as here forever.
Sticking to that expectation, we've come to realize the Canadian Immigrations Levels Plan from 2021 to 2023, under which 1.2 million new permanent residents are said to be welcomed into Canada. Can a set of those immigrants use Canada to realize their own self-interest, to kind of view Canada as a stepping stone without having to bear the burden of becoming responsible citizens without an emotional connection to the nation?
Well, this goes back to my prior answer. I think a proportion of immigrants who have that orientation would not be a big challenge. I think the country could manage that. If, on the other hand, the great bulk of immigrants thought of Canada as a temporary location and had no interest in helping build the society and the culture, that would be a very different kind of country. I mean, we have to, I think, maintain a capacity to do things together, to build robust social programs and healthcare systems, to carry out national projects, to defend ourselves and present our interests in the international community. And so I suspect that deep down at some level, we do need the majority, the bulk of immigrants to join us in a meaningful way.
So immigrants obviously mean a multicultural society. However, is it overly pessimistic and xenophobic to bring into discussion possible disadvantages of a multicultural society?
No, I think any concept which is untouchable becomes a weak concept over time. Definitely. Becomes vulnerable to challenges, or more vulnerable to challenge than it would have been if it had been contested throughout. And I think it's fair to say that multiculturalism as a concept in Canada has been contested regularly. There are doubters. There's a challenge in Quebec, which has rejected multiculturalism as a way of thinking about a diverse society and has its own intercultural approach. And there is a portion of Canadians tending to be relatively conservative Canadians who've always been uneasy, not necessarily imposed, but uneasy with multiculturalism, and who've wanted to put more emphasis on a common culture. So I think the idea in Canada has been contested on a regular basis. So far, it has retained this overwhelming support in the public as a whole. And unlike other countries, certainly in Europe, we have never politically turned our back on the idea of multiculturalism as an organizing device. And I think we are now so diverse that if we rejected the idea of multiculturalism, we'd have to come up with something similar as a way of describing the kind of country we are.
Well, language is an essential component to any culture. Can a state which has 2 European languages as the official language truly be a multicultural society? Canada's immigration process requires proficiency in the official language and for all the celebration of diversity. Why has Canada failed to be linguistically inclusive?
I think there are 2 goals, 2 values, 2 important principles at work here. One is the multicultural process, which shapes how we approach issues of immigrant integration. But the other core principle in Canada is democracy, is building a common political process where everyone can participate together. And I, for one, tend to think that a common language, or in the Canadian case, two languages, is important for that process. People who do not speak either of the two official languages are people who are unlikely to be able to participate in our political processes, to be marginalized. Although it may seem an imposition, and in a sense it is, I do think it's an imposition, an expectation that I would support. Now, I have to say, not every diverse country insists on embracing the common language as a condition for citizenship. I was once in Sweden, and I said what I've just said, that I think is important to democracy, that newcomers learn one of the official languages and can participate in our politics. And I was told that position was racist. That is, it was fundamental. In Sweden, they do not require new citizens to speak Swedish. And they are prepared to live with the fact that a growing percentage of their population may not be able to participate in their politics. I think that makes me fundamentally uneasy, but I admit that humane countries can make different choices here.
Well, staying with that theme, there is a strong sense of Western hegemony in the cultures the immigrants are to assimilate in. How much of the Canadian mosaic suffer from the problem of cultural hegemony and Western impositions of morality? Is there a sense of an imposition of morality and culture on a Western morality or Western culture that immigrants are said to assimilate in?
I'm sure that for immigrants from non-Western countries, they must feel it. I don't think it's embedded in our philosophy and our law. And it is striking that Canada has, over time, taken a number of steps to try and minimize, symbolically at least, the European origins. So the change in the flag in 1965 from one with the Union Jack up in the top corner to our current flag was one sign of an attempt to build a conception of the country and a culture that was more diverse. But I would agree that the dominant European style culture is still, well, if you add French and English speaking people of British and French heritage, that's a big proportion of the total. And so European style thinking is still pretty important. The only thing I would say in defense of it is, it goes back to this issue of democracy. I'm a big fan of liberal democracy, where there is a defined set of rights, which we protect. And that conception often bumps up against conceptions of cultural diversity and may often be seen as an imposition. So we've seen this tension play out in France with the publication of cartoons of Mohammed, seen as a or a manifestation of free speech, but is culturally offensive. So I'm prepared to accept there's a tension here between, on one hand, a liberal democratic norm of protecting rights and often cultural sensitivities, which may be non-European in origin. I accept it's a problem or a tension, but I think it's one we're probably stuck with.
Multiculturalism is said to be a song and dance production, a kind of toleration of racialized others by the majority white population, especially in Canada. To what degree do you think Canadian multiculturalism tolerates other norms and values?
Other norms and values other than which?
Other than the Canadian set of ideals, other than liberal democratic principles,
Well, I think there are tension points. And there are times when the law is applied unequally. And that's a serious problem. So for example, the case of polygamy, governments have taken polygamous families to court in the case of immigrant or indigenous immigrant communities, but they for decades tolerated polygamous family organization in British Columbia. And so I think there are cases where laws are applied unequally. And I think that there are probably more constraints, more tensions than you absolutely need in a liberal democratic country. So I'm kind of circling back to my answer to the last question. We have two values here, liberal democracy and multiculturalism. There will be a tension, an ongoing tension between them. There's no simple solution, and we have to take each case on a case-by-case basis, but make sure we do it in a way that's even-handed.
Mm-hmm. Well, sticking with the problems of multiculturalism and highlighting those problems, does Canada's policy of multiculturalism undermine the diversity of population subgroups by homogenizing them? Are terminologies like Asian, Indian, Muslim, Black paving the way for identity politics in Canada, possibly?
Well, I think there are two separate questions there. I don't think there's anything inherent in the idea of multiculturalism, which requires a particular set of categories. We could have a much more refined set of categories than the big categories which bring into them often very diverse people. So I don't think multiculturalism is responsible for that. And indeed, the criticism of Canada for a long time, including by the UN, is that we tend to smother all of those differences in the category visible minorities. And for a long time, the data we gathered and the way we talked about diversity obscured enormous amounts. So there is a sense in which a more complex set of categories is probably showing that whereas the average immigrant is doing well, there are categories of immigrants who are not doing well. Now, does that contribute to identity politics? I think we would get identity politics irrespective of the categories we used, as long as we were talking about forms of cultural difference and multiple identities in societies, we would get identity politics. I think that's inherent in being a diverse country. And I don't think it's driven by the particular categories by which you organize that debate.
Mm-hmm. Well, can identity politics then lead to ethnic separatism? Is it realistic to imagine ethnic separatism in Canada?
I think that would be highly unlikely. The one thing about, there is what you might call ethnic separatism in the case of Quebec. But Quebec is a sub-state nation. It thinks of itself as a distinct nation and can conceive of itself as an independent country. But in the case of immigrants, people who've come here as immigrants, the overwhelming orientation that they have brought to the country is a desire to join the mainstream. Now, they want that mainstream to change, or they want that mainstream to be accommodative. They don't want to surrender all of the culture and traditions that they bring with them to be able to join the kind of mainstream economic, social, and political life of the country. And so the emergence of ethnic separatism would be a new departure, I think. Now, there may be some groups which feel really unwelcome and who organize themselves quite separately, but there are very few minorities, I can't think of any, who build a kind of parallel society inside. The Europeans worry about parallel societies where people live exclusively in their ethnic enclave. We don't, it is true that in geographic terms, there are communities in particular parts of cities and so on. That's true. But in terms of an entire parallel society with all of the infrastructure that goes with that, you know, schools and universities and public health systems, healthcare systems, separate, that's not been the norm here. So I think that as a problem is actually quite low on the list of the many problems we have.
But you've previously talked about economic and cultural insecurities as the cause for the rise of populist sentiments within Canada. So under the Immigrations Levels Plan, as Canada plans on welcoming approximately 1.2 million new immigrants, do you think that would warrant a rise in populist sentiments? Could there be a backlash? Could there be a backlash to the likes of that was seen in the United States in Brexit?
Yeah, so Canada has the economic anxieties that prevail in other countries. We have had the same kind of economic transformations, globalization, technological change, the rise of inequality, the rise of precarious employment, all of that. All the things that have been seen as drivers of backlash elsewhere are here. The other part of backlash is cultural anxiety, and you get that in other countries where people say, immigration is changing my country so fast, I do not recognize it. And that all of our cultural history and traditions are disappearing. So the economic and the cultural anxiety become a toxic mix. Now, move to Canada. We have those anxieties, but there's one very distinctive thing about Canada. When you come to Canadians' attitudes towards immigration, about 70% of Canadians think that immigration is good for the economy. We may have about half of Canadians who think that immigrants don't, too many immigrants don't adopt Canadian values. There's a touch of cultural anxiety, but there is a base of support in the country for immigration on economic grounds. And what that means is that opponents of immigration, populist, backlash opponents of immigration cannot bring together economic and cultural anxiety into a toxic stew. It's just harder here because people believe it's an economic plus. Now, on the particular question of numbers, one of the things we have noticed in looking at trends in public opinion over a very long time is that big jumps, sudden big jumps in immigration levels can produce unease, political backlash. It does in other countries. It has in Canada in the early 1990s, for example. And so it's always been important that I think that two things have been important. One is that the rate of growth be relatively incremental. That you're not, you saw an immense backlash in Europe in 2015 when you had this massive movement into Europe of Syrian refugees. So incremental change, 5% a year, something like that, doesn't pose a problem. And it's really important that the unemployment rate not take off. So the Liberal government has been increasing immigration in recent years steadily, but it hasn't done what some people want to go to 400,000 overnight, but it's been steadily moving it up incrementally, which doesn't trigger alarm bells, and in a period with declining unemployment rates. And that allows for the proposition that immigration is good for the economy to remain believable.
Well, because of the pandemic, immigration is said to be a driver in terms of recovering from the economic loss that was created due to COVID-19. However, we at CIN have noticed a significant drop in the comprehensive ranking system score, which welcomes new immigrants. Will the quantity of the immigrants coming into the country have an impact on the quality of the immigrants coming in?
That's a good question. I'm not enough of a specialist in the precise formula driving emissions at the moment. I think there's a special circumstance which is generated by the pandemic. But what I would say is that our immigration process has tended to favor higher levels of education and skills. And there are a lot of semi-skilled positions where there are jobs that are available. So I guess I'm a little less worried. I'd be worried if it was a long-term issue, because I think the high levels of skills of many, or at least of the economic stream, has been critical to the maintenance of this idea that immigration is a good thing for the Canadian economy, which has, I think, underpinned the level of public support for immigration. So if what you're describing is a long-term phenomenon, it will change the political dynamics in the country.
Well, we have also noticed that the economic class of the immigrants that are coming in is an integral part to Canada's economic growth, Canada's social growth, and we estimate that about 60% of new immigrants coming into Canada belong to the economic class. Is a class-based preference on immigration not inherently discriminatory? Is there a problem with the class-based preference, or is it just a matter of national interest of Canada?
Well, I think it's a matter of national interest of Canada. Many people regard the Canadian immigration system as ethically incorrect, that we are skimming talent from the rest of the world, and that that there's something inappropriate. Now, unless you're going to go to something like a lottery for admission, you're going to have criteria. Mm-hmm. And I think that the real debate in Canada is a relative mix between the different streams, and whether the economic class is too large and the family class and the refugee classes are too small. I would put the focus of the debate there rather than on the general question of whether seeking skills is fundamentally discriminatory. The short answer is it is. It's in the national interest. And I think that we could have a debate about that question by looking at the relative balance of the streams. It's only since the early 1990s that the economic stream became so big. If you go back to as late as 1991, 2, 3, the family stream was the biggest. Mm-hmm. And we made a serious decision to turn immigration into an economic tool in that period.
All right, so we have come to the last question for our discussion, Professor Banting. Thank you for your time. It has been a fruitful discussion. We've learned a lot from your expertise. So the last question is, well, as immigration is steadily becoming the largest contributor to population growth in Canada, Canada has been painted as a pioneer of diversity, as a pioneer of multiculturalism. And it is said that Canada has a unique brand when it comes to multiculturalism. However, multicultural societies have existed in the world for centuries. We have examples in Asia, we have examples in Africa. So is the Canadian brand of multiculturalism truly a novelty and an exception?
No, I don't think so. You don't have to go as far as Asia or Africa to find other countries that have adopted a multiculturalism strategy towards diversity. And in some cases, independently of the Canadian or Australian examples. Sweden is a case. Sweden developed multiculturalism policies basically at the same time. In fact, they started a little bit earlier than Canada. They started in the 1960s, and it reflected the fact that they had a history of immigration. In the early days, mainly from other Nordic countries. And there was a Jewish population inflow for a period. That was not dissimilar from Canada, which had an inflow of European immigrants in the main at the time they introduced the multiculturalism program. And then both countries over time gradually expanded the range of diversity that their multicultural first steps came to embrace. So I don't think the Canadian experience is unique. I do think Canada gets a lot of attention, partly because we perhaps embraced the concept a little more formally. Earlier, a lot of countries did things that were kind of multicultural, but didn't codify it, didn't think about it. And of course, we had some really serious internationally ranked political theorists, philosophers, students of diversity and the relationship between diversity and liberal democracy, and people like Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, Charles Tully. These people created a set of ideas around the concept and set the international debate, at least in the academic community, about how to think about these issues. People might look at what they said and reject it vigorously, and in some countries they did. But I think that's one reason why Canada Canada did it. We are a clearly multicultural country, although Quebec, I don't think I would describe as multicultural anymore. But Canada overall is a multicultural country, but it contributed to thinking about how to think, thinking about how to manage the idea of diversity and a democracy. And I think that was important to the brand. So a lot of, and the federal government contributed for a period by trying to market the idea to other countries. It was in the late 1900s. It was official policy of the Foreign Affairs Department, External Affairs as it was then, to try and suggest to other countries they might think about the Canadian model for themselves. So it was partly academic and political marketing.
Perfect. So this has been Professor Banting. Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure having you. And we hope that a lot of immigrants coming into Canada or existing Canadians can learn from this conversation, understand what it means to be a Canadian today, and contribute to this great country. Thank you, Professor Banting.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.